Hi, I'm Adam Summer. You're listening to the Yerushalmi Talk podcast with the support of the Yeshivat Devar Yerushalayim in Har Nof, Jerusalem. This is Terumos, Chapter 1, Halacha 1. This is part 6 of this year. In the art scroll, we're on page 6A1. Today we are getting into the non-Jew who tries to separate Truma from the produce of a Jew. And in fact, the Mishnah was putting a list together of people who are not fit to separate out Truma. And in this list, the Mishnah finishes off and says, an idol worshiper, but that's going to be a non-Jew, who separates Truma from the produce of a Jew, that their Truma is not valid Truma. Now, why would that be? Well, the Gemara is going to elaborate. Rabbi Zera and Rabbi Acha quoted Rabbi Yasa, says his Gemara, who quoted Rabbi Yochanan, who said in the name of Rabbi Yanai, that the verse states in Numbers 18:28, it says, you shall separate the Truma, but adds an extra word, writing, you also shall separate the Truma. So when you look at that, what are we doing with this you also? And the word also is included, says the Gemara, to include your agents. And this is to teach that just as you yourself can separate your Truma, so too may your agents separate out Truma. And the idea here is that by mentioning the agent together with the owner in this way, this you also, the verse is establishing a hekish. That's going to be where this is like an example that carries out to other things. And that's going to be between the owner of the Truma and his agent. So Rabbi Yanai puts this together as a parallel. And the Gemara continues, it says, just as you, the owners, are members of the covenant of, people who are Jewish and observe the mitzvahs and are required to, that the Rashi, in his parallel commentary in Bavli Kiddushin 41b, he's saying over there that the verse you is speaking to a Jew. And these are the people who are party to the covenant of circumcision, and they entered the covenant of mitzvah observance. So that the Gemara continues and says, so too your agents to separate Truma must be members of the covenant of mitzvah observance. And this is why it's going to exclude, says Rabbi Yanai, the idol worshiper from acting as an agent. Now, this hekish is trying to teach that the agent must be in the same category as the owner. In other words, that just as you, the owner, is a Jew, so too your agent must be a Jew. And they also must be obligated in mitzvahs. What's one of the mitzvahs? Well, separating out Trumos. So accordingly, only a Jew, says Rosh Rilio, can serve as an agent for another Jew, and an idol worshiper cannot be appointed as one's agent to separate out Truma. So it's very interesting that the agent must be in the same class for mitzvah observance as the owner, and that's the idea because the Trumos separation is a mitzvah, right? So the Rabbi Yanai is going to conclude with another lesson from this hekish. What else can we learn from this? And this verse is also coming to teach you, says this Gemara, that only you, a Jew, can appoint an agent to separate out Truma, but an idol worshiper can't appoint an agent to separate out Truma. In other words, the verse is teaching that somebody can appoint an agent to separate Truma. This is addressing you, meaning the Jew. And this implies only a Jew is empowered to appoint an agent, but the idol worshiper is not. And therefore, the idol worshiper can neither serve as an agent, which we just said, but they also are not allowed to appoint an agent for Truma separation. And the Gemara now is going to look at this precise meaning of the latter part of Rabbi Yanai's teaching. Rabbi Yosei, says his Gemara, thought to say that this means that an idol worshiper cannot appoint his fellow idol worshiper as an agent. But with regard to appointing a Jew, an idol worshiper can appoint him as his agent. In other words, says Rabbi Kanievsky in his Beur shiurim, that Rabbi Yosei thought that an idol worshiper is excluded only from acting as an agent. whether for a Jew or for another idol worshiper, but he is not excluded from appointing an agent. In other words, the first part of Rabbi Yanai's teaching means that a Jew cannot designate an idol worshiper as an agent, but the second part, according to Rabbi Yossi, as explained by Rabbi Kanievsky, means that an idol worshiper cannot designate another idol worshiper as an agent, but an idol worshiper can appoint a Jew as his agent. So if he wanted to tithe his produce, he can designate a Jew to do it for him. Now, whether that's going to be the halacha or not, and there are people who say that an idol worshiper can serve as an agent for another idol worshiper, but the point is that we're trying to understand, what is Rabbi Yossi doing with this? How does he understand Rabbi Yanai's statement? And Rabbi Zera doesn't understand it like this. Rabbi Zera says in his Gemara that, he says back to Rabbi Yossi, that from the verse itself, we can see that an idol worshiper can't appoint even a Jew to be his agent. And this is seen as follows. It says, when the verse is teaching that you, a Jew, can appoint an agent, that it is not dealing with the case where a Jew will become the agent. Certainly it is, right? So, in other words, as explained by Rabbi Kanievsky, we're deriving that from the phrase you also. It's meaning that the agent has to be a member of the covenant, just like the one who appoints him. So it's following that similarly, when the verse teaches that an idol worshiper can't appoint an agent, it refers even to where the agent is a Jew. Now, the idea is that, says Marafulda, that the phrase you also from the Torah is teaching that both a Jew can appoint an agent and an idol worshiper can't do it. And clearly, it's excluding an idol worshiper from appointing an agent, and is referring to the same type of person whom a Jew can appoint as an agent. In other words, a Jew. So that an idol worshiper is excluded from appointing a Jew as his agent, and an idol worshiper is excluded from both serving as an agent on behalf of anybody, including a Jew, by the way, and from appointing anyone, including a Jew, to be his agent. That's what Rabbi Zera is saying, that what this means. So the Gemara continues, says, it follows that similarly, when the verse teaches that an idol worshiper can't appoint an agent, it refers to where the agent is a Jew. So the Gemara is going to defend Rabbi Yossi. Rabbi Hoshaya retorts back and says, but the following brisa supports the view of Rabbi Yossi, that an idol worshiper can appoint a Jew, his agent, to separate out truma. Now, this is a Tosefta in Demai 6.1. But again, it's in Demai, which means that we're not talking necessarily about biblical truma, we're talking about the Rabbanan. So, there's going to be leniencies there. Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel said regarding a Jewish sharecropper working on an idol worshiper's land, what if this idol worshiper does not wish to separate truma from his produce? He need not separate out truma, because an idol worshiper is not obligated to tithe his produce, and since the Jew can't assume that the idol worshiper intends to separate truma from his portion of the crop, he may not separate it from the idol worshiper's portion without his consent. This is implying that if it was known that the idol worshiper did tithe his produce, that the Jewish sharecropper could separate truma for him. So it looks like the Jew can act as the idol worshiper's agent to separate out truma. This looks like it supports the view of Rabbi Yossi. It contradicts the view of Rabbi Zera. But keep in mind, everything that we're talking about with the sharecropping over for the Jew working on behalf of the non-Jew and growing grain, this is a time after the tithes are deraita. This is a time when it's derabanan. So there's a leniency in here because these are not biblically required tithes at this time. So the Gemara, of course, is going to object to this proof, and Rabbi Abba says that, in fact, an idol worshiper can't appoint a Jew as an agent from separating truma, as Rabbi Zera ruled, because the brisa is implying that a Jew can tithe an idol worshiper's produce. And the brisa is dealing with a case where the idol worshiper guides the Jew's hand and is himself involved in the tithing. So only there can the Jew separate the idol worshiper's truma, but he can't separate it when he acts independently as the agent. In other words, Marafulda is going to be saying that Rabbi Abba is explaining that Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel's ruling is not that the truma is valid if the idol worshiper merely consents, but that it is valid if he actually is present and participates in the tithing. And the Vilna Goan is going to be saying that this is similar to a case where a minor child was left in a gourd field to separate truma from his father's produce. And according to the opinion of the sages there, the minor can't act as the father's agent to separate the truma, but if the father guides the minor's hand and participates in the act, then it's deemed to have sanctified the portion that the minor separated. And Derech Hamuna is also pointing out, this is Rabbi Kanievsky's commentary, that if the idol worshiper separates truma from the Jew's produce and the Jew guides his hand, that the separation is valid because it is actually the Jew who is separating the truma from his own crop. And that's a key idea. In other words, that the Jew now is involved and he's actually like guiding the hand. Now, the Gemara is going to look at another teaching of Rabbi Yochanan in the name of his teacher Rabbi Yanai regarding separating tithes from someone else's produce. The Gemara says that Rabbi Yochanan said in the name of Rabbi Yanai that if a Yisrael says to a Levi, there is a core of Meiser Rishon for you in my possession. A core, by the way, is a measurement. And basically, the Yisrael is telling the Levi that he will give him a core of Meiser Rishon that he separates out from his crop. So the Gemara continues and says, and before he received the Meiser Rishon crops, that Levi went and made it Terumos Meiser for other Meiser Rishon produce that he had elsewhere. In other words, says the Derech Hamuna, that from the Meiser Rishon that he receives, a Levi must separate 1/10 as Terumos Meiser, which he then gives to the Kohen, by the way. And in that case, the Levi had already 9 core of Meiser Rishon produce from which we had to separate the Truma Meiser. So he's designating the core of Meiser Rishon that he had promised to the Yisrael as Terumos Meiser for that other produce. So he's basically promising something that he's done something else with. And so the Gemara says, but the Yisrael did not keep his word, and he went and he gave the Meiser Rishon to another Levi. The law is that the first Levi has nothing against the Yisrael except a valid cause of complaint, and his Terumos Meiser separation is not valid. So that he can't file a suit against the Yisrael for stealing the Meiser. He can only claim that the Yisrael failed to keep his promise. Now, you're not allowed to hold a grudge against another person for no reason, and certainly if somebody reneges on a commitment, you're allowed to hold it against them, you're not allowed to hold it against them. I'm sorry, you can hold it against him until he asks for forgiveness. And over in this kind of case where he's doing something else with it, in that case, what he did is he promised it to this guy and then he gave it to another guy. In other words, he didn't steal from the Levi because he gave it to the tribe of Levi, just give it to a different one. And since the Levi never performed a kinyan on the core of the Meiser Rishon that he was promised, the Israel has the ability to retract it and to give it to another Levi. But the first Levi can't designate it as Terumos Meiser. So although the Israel has the ability to give the Meiser Rishon to another Levi, he's not allowed to do it because it indicates a lack of integrity. And Baba Metzia 49a in the Bavli is holding that when the Israel tells a Levi that he will give him a core of Meiser, he promised him a small gift. And so, this is saying that if somebody promises his fellow a small gift, he's not allowed to renege on that promise because it's considered a lack of integrity. And it's for this reason that if the Israel does renege, the Levi is entitled to bear a grudge against him. And the Gemara is going to qualify this ruling, and it's going to say that this ruling is stated regarding a case where this is going to be the Israel, gave the Meiser Rishon to the second Levi before the first one made it into Terumos Meiser. Again, the Levi has to separate what he gets as a Meiser Rishon, take out the Terumos Meiser. But now the question is what if the Levi had his own grain and assumed that he was getting other grain. You're allowed to combine this grain for that grain. And he tithed on behalf of his own grain, not only on behalf of his own grain, but also the grain that was promised for him. So he did a bigger batch. Well, what about this bigger batch now? Is that also going to have a part in it that is reneged? Is that also going to be the a valid Trumas Meiser? Well, Trumas Meiser has to be exact, so that if, say, he was designating on behalf of his own grain as well as that which he thought was coming right away to him, and that was already coming to him, what would you do with that? In other words, what happens with that? So this ruling is stated where this one, the Yisrael gave the Meiser Rishon to the different Levi before the first one made it into Trumas Meiser. But if that one, the first Levi, made it into Truma Meiser before this one, in other words, the Yisrael gave it to the second Levi, it's not so. In other words, once the first Levi designates the Meiser Rishon produce as Trumas Meiser, the Yisrael now can't undo the decision. He can't undo this designation. So he has to go, it has to go to a Kohen, and the Yisrael no longer can retract and give that produce to another Levi as Meiser. In other words, the separation has to be exact. And now that the Yisrael is not going to give it to him, but it's already been tithed, he has to finish up the produce. He has to finish up this process. Why? Because it now belongs to the tribe of the Goan. And now you actually can go to a court to collect it, because now it's not the Levi's and it's not the Yisrael's anymore. It's not in their possession. It's now been transferred over to the tribe of the Kohanim. So the Yisrael or the Levi are just holding it as a guardian, but it's not either one of theirs anymore. So that's why the Yisrael would have to finish this transaction. So the Gemara is going to cite support for this assertion and explain why the Yisrael can't undo the Levi's Trumas Meiser designation. In other words, let's say that, again, we saw this in Masechet Demai, you're allowed to designate on behalf of two grain piles for Trumas Meiser or Meiser Rishon. And so you could designate from this and that, and if they're close together or even not close together. And so he says, okay, I'm giving it to you, I'm bringing it over to you now. And he says, okay, well, I have some grain now that I want to designate anyway, and I'll add the one that I have to what's coming now, because you've already, said you're giving it to me. And I'm going to take out the Trumas Meiser, which has to go to the Kohen. Levi has to give it to the Kohen. That's what the Torah says. So now, if the guy reneges, the Yisrael reneges and doesn't give it to the Levi, he really can't undo it because it's already been done and it has to be exact. So this is in accordance, says this Gemara, with the Mishnah that is in here in Terumos 3.2 and also reflected in Bavli Kiddushin 59a, where it says if somebody appointed an agent to separate Truma from his produce and he nullified the agency, the law is like this. If he nullified the agency before the agent separated out the Truma, the agent's Truma is not a valid Truma separation. But if he nullified the agency after the agent separated out the Truma, the agent's Truma is a valid Truma separation. So what we see here is that once you have an authorized person separating out Truma from somebody else's produce, the owner can't undo that separation. And in our case also, if the first Levi already made the Truma Meiser declaration and designation, the Yisrael now can't void it, and he can't give that produce to someone else. Again, part of this now belongs to a different tribe. They're just holders of it. It's not theirs anymore. So that's why he can't give it to somebody else, because he has a portion in there that now belongs to someone else. And so, the Yisrael, the Levi has in there something that belongs to someone else, but it was designated on behalf of the grain pile of the Yisrael, and because he promised this untithed grain over to the Levi. Levi was just doing what he's supposed to do, but now you can't undo it because you can't undo because it was basically a valid declaration. You can't now undo it because it has kedusha, it has sanctity. So the Gemara is going to object to the premise that the Levi is authorized to designate the produce he was promised as Trumas Meiser even before he gets it, And it says, but is it in the Levi's power to separate Trumas Meiser from the Meiser Rishon before he actually receives it? And, didn't he have to take possession? The Gemara is going to answer. It's going to say that once the Israel said to Levi, there's a core of Meiser Rishon for you in my possession, the Levi in effect becomes his agent to separate Trumas Meiser from that produce. And it emerges that he separates the Truma Meiser with the Israel's permission. In other words, the act of saying this, he's basically tacitly made the Levi an agent for separating out Trumas Meiser from his produce, says Rabbi Kanievsky. So you've worded it in a way where you've given him agency. And now we're going to look at this other point that the Levi has the Israel's permission to separate out Trumas Meiser, and this is only effective if the Israel himself is authorized to separate out Trumas Meiser. In other words, in the normal procedure, the Israel gives the Meiser Rishon to a Levi, and then the Levi separates out Trumas Meiser to give it to a Kohen. But since the Israel himself can't separate out Trumas Meiser from his Meiser Rishon, how can he appoint a Levi as his agent to separate out Trumas Meiser on his behalf? Gemara is going to explain how this works. It says, interpret this in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Yossi. Rabbi Yossi says in a brisa that if a Israel who is a homeowner separated all his tithes, including Trumas Meiser from his produce, and before giving the Meiser Rishon to a Levi, what he has done is done. In other words, his designation is going to be valid. And although it's generally the Levi who separates out Trumas Meiser, if the Israel went ahead and did it, his designation is still valid. He gives the Truma Meiser portion to the Kohen of his choice, and the remaining Meiser Rishon to the Levi of his choice. Now, Rabbi Yossi is talking about a case where the designation is valid after the fact. And the Bavli, by the way, is citing an opinion from Tana that the Israel is allowed, even in the first place, to separate out Truma Meiser before giving the Meiser Rishon to a Levi. And there's a lot of commentators, though, who understand that Rabbi Yossi is disagreeing and holding that the Israel's Trumas Meiser designation is valid only after the fact, but he may not do it initially. And since, in Rabbi Yossi's view, Israel is able to separate out Trumas Meiser from his Meiser Rishon, he can also appoint another person to be his agent to do it. So, in other words, he retains the right to separate Trumas Meiser from it. And the Gemara is defending Rabbi Yochanan's ruling that if a Levi was promised Meiser Rishon by a Yisrael, and he designates it out as Trumas Meiser, that designation stands. Why? Because the Yisrael could simply separate the Truma Meiser from the Meiser Rishon, and he can empower the Levi to act as an agent. But once the Levi carries out the act, the Yisrael is no longer able to nullify that agency. In other words, it's already been done. So the Gemara is going to give another ruling of Rabbi Yochanan in the name of Rabbi Yanai. Rabbi Yochanan said in the name of Rabbi Yanai that if a Yisrael said to a Levi, there's a core of Meiser Rishon for you in my possession, but I want to buy it from you, and here's money for it, the Levi must be concerned about the Truma Meiser within the produce. In other words, he has to be worried that the Yisrael did not separate out Trumas Meiser from it. And by the way, the Meiser Rishon is property of the Levi, and it doesn't have sanctity, and it's permitted for consumption even by Yisrael once its Trumas Meiser has been removed. Until the Truma Meiser has been removed, though, it is tevel. So there are two things that have to be taken out and given to the Kohen to unlock the tevel status of the produce. And eating tevel on purpose is a very serious crime. And you have the Truma Gedola, and you have to also take out the Truma Meiser from the Levi's portion of the Meiser Rishon. So the Levi here has to be worried that the owner did not separate out Trumas Meiser from the Meiser Rishon. And if the Israel actually does not separate out Trumas Meiser, he will be the one who sins by eating untithed Meiser Rishon, not the Levi. And since the Levi accepts the payment for all the Meiser Rishon, and a tenth of the Meiser Rishon has to be set aside as Trumas Meiser, the Levi is in possession of payment of produce that by right should go to a Kohen. To avoid any kind of something looking like theft, and also, by the way, to protect the Israel from sinning, the Levi has to set aside some of his own Meiser Rishon as Trumas Meiser for the produce of what's in the Israel's possession and give it to the Kohen. And he can then enjoy all the money he receives without any issue. So in other words, let's say he has his own grain pile and he says, okay, well, I'll take a little bit out extra for this other pile that is part of this transaction now, and I'll give that over to a Cohen. Then there's no problem. He doesn't need to take out of the money, but he has to have a portion that's extra that is untithed, and then basically he can tithe on what's behalf of the portion that he has, plus a little extra for the other portion, and then he'll be okay. So the Gemara says that, as we see in this incident, there was a Yisrael named Ilo Fosa that he gave Rabbi Shimon bar Abba Meiser Rishon, and he said to him, "It is rectified." In other words, the Truma Meiser has been taken out of it. Rabbi Shimon bar Abba then came and asked Rabbi Yochanan whether he could rely on that claim. And Rabbi Yochanan said to him, Ilo Fosa, our brother, is trustworthy. In other words, you can infer from Rabbi Yochanan's statement that if we do not know that a particular person is trustworthy, we can not rely on him to have separated out Trumas Meiser. This, by the way, gets into Maseket Demai issues, right? You're not allowed to rely on an Amma Aretz that he separated out the tithes properly. You can rely on a Chaver, who is a learned person and a Torah scholar. You're allowed to trust them that they say it, but not an Amma Aretz. So the question is, what about Ilo Fosa? So the Gemara is going to comment on this. Rabbi Isa inquired before Rabbi Yochanan and said, in accordance with whom is this ruling stated? It says, in accordance with Rabbi Yossi. Rabbi Yossi said in the Brisa, if a Yisrael who is a homeowner separated all the tithes, including Trumas Meiser from his produce, before giving the Meiser Rishon to a Levi, what he has done, he has done. In other words, that designation is going to be valid. And, the Tanna Kama in that Brisa disagrees and holds that the Yisrael separation of Truma Meiser is not valid, since it's only according to Rabbi Yossi that Ilo Fesa's separation of the Trumas Meiser is valid, and he's relying on it. So maybe he's going to be ruling, maybe Rabbi Yochanan's ruling and Rabbi Yanai's ruling like Rabbi Yossi. So the case is like this, right? When this, Ilo Fosa came to Rabbi Shimon bar Abba and he gave him the Meiser Rishon, and he says to him that, I took out the Trumas Meiser. Well, he's not really supposed to do that, but he did it. That's what it's saying. Now, can you rely on that? And Rabbi Yochanan says back that he says to Rabbi Issa, yes, Babylonian, you've understood it properly. In other words, Rabbi Asi or Rabbi Issa here, and by the way, it's going to be Rabbi Yasa elsewhere in the Yerushalmi. He moved from Bavel to Eretz Yisrael, and although Rabbi Yossi is not the only Tana who holds that Yisrael is able to separate out Trumas Meiser, and possibly the Gemara here is mentioning specifically Rabbi Yossi, not to exclude all the other Tanaim, but pointing out that Rabbi Yochanan abandoned the opinion of the Tanna Kama, who, by the way, the Halacha usually follows, in favor of Rabbi Yossi's opinion. And so that's an interesting tidbit that looks like, according to Rabbi Yochanan, and basically based on Rabbi Yanai, that it's going to be like Rabbi Yossi. In other words, that the designation is going to be retroactively valid after the fact, and that's why you can rely on Ilo Fesa's thing where he took out the Trumas Meiser, even though he's a Yisrael, and presumably, by the way, he was also a Torah scholar or Haver. Otherwise, you wouldn't be allowed to rely on any of it. So we're going to get into the next part of the Mishnah tomorrow, where it's talking about a deaf person who can speak but cannot hear. Have a great day.